the morning my husband sent me a birthday cake, laced with something that should have killed me. The sun was doing that thing it does in late October in Vancouver. Pale gold, almost apologetic, coming through the kitchen window at exactly the angle that made everything look softer than it was. I remember standing at the counter with my coffee, watching the light catch the rim of my mug, thinking, 38 isn't so bad. 38 feels like something. Like maybe things are finally settling. I didn't know my husband was upstairs in his home office, on the phone with her, telling her to be patient, that it would all be over soon. His name is Garrett. We'd been married 11 years. I should back up. My name is Sylvia, and I run the Canadian operations of a mid-sized logistics firm my mother built from nothing in the 90s. When she passed 4 years ago, she left it to me. The business, the house in Point Grey, a trust that my financial advisor calls substantial. I didn't come from money in the flashy sense. My mother drove a used Subaru until the year she died. But she was careful and she was smart and she loved me, and so when she was gone, I found myself with more than I ever expected to have. Garrett came into my life 2 years before she died. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who remembered what you ordered at a restaurant and brought it up 3 months later. He was a project manager at an architecture firm. Good at his job, easy to be around. My mother liked him. I think about that sometimes. We married quietly. A small ceremony at a vineyard in the Okanagan, maybe 40 people. No fuss. I'm not a fuss kind of person. For the first several years, things were good. Or they seemed good. I've spent a lot of time since then, turning the marriage over in my hands, looking for the seams, the places where the glue was already weakening. I find things. I find a lot of things. But at the time I didn't see them. What I did notice, about 2 years before my 38th birthday, was a shift in Garrett. Small things at first. A new password on his phone. Evenings when he'd go quiet in a way that felt directed, like the silence was aimed at me. He started going to the gym at odd hours. He started talking about money differently, with a kind of hungry attention he'd never had before. I told myself it was stress. His firm had restructured. He'd been passed over for a senior role he thought he deserved. I told myself men go through things and don't always know how to talk about them. I made space. I was patient. I was also, I realize now, deliberately not looking. The woman's name was Petra. She worked at a commercial real estate company downtown, in one of those glass towers on West Georgia. She was 31. I know all of this now. At the time, I knew nothing. What I did know, by late that fall, was that something in my marriage had gone wrong in a way I couldn't name, but could feel the way you feel weather changing. In the pressure somewhere behind your eyes. My birthday is October 24th. 3 days before it, I came home to find Garrett in what I can only describe as an unusually good mood. Solicitous. Attentive in a way that felt performed. He asked if I'd made plans, whether I wanted to go out for dinner, whether I'd heard from my friend Louisa about the weekend. He was asking a lot of questions. He was watching me with something that wasn't quite affection. I said I hadn't made any specific plans. My birthday had been low-key for a few years since my mother died. I usually spent it quietly. He said he'd ordered something for me. A cake from a specialty bakery in Kitsilano, the one I love, the one that does the layered honey cake with the cardamom cream. He said he'd had it delivered to my office for the next day, a surprise, so I could share it with my team. I thought it was sweet. I actually thought it was sweet. What I didn't know then, what I only learned later, from a detective and then from Garrett himself in a police interview I was shown months afterward, was that the night before, after I'd gone to bed, Garrett had been in the kitchen for nearly 2 hours. He'd ordered the cake, yes, but he'd also picked up the box himself from the bakery that morning, before I woke up. He'd opened it carefully. He had something prepared in a small glass vial, a compound, the toxicologist would later say, that dissolves without taste in fat-based cream. Something a person could source, if they knew where to look, if they'd spent months planning and were methodical about it. He'd told the bakery that he'd be picking it up himself to add a personal decoration. They'd handed it over without question. Why wouldn't they? He resealed the box. He called his courier app and booked a delivery driver for the next morning, with the office address, with the instruction to leave it at the reception desk. He went to bed. He slept next to me. I've thought about that a lot. The morning of October 23rd, I left for the office before Garrett was up. I had a 7:30 call with our partners in Halifax, and then back-to-back meetings until noon. I didn't think about the cake. I was thinking about container logistics and a customs delay in Prince Rupert, and whether our regional coordinator needed more support. What happened at the office that morning is something I've reconstructed mostly from security footage and from talking to the people involved. The driver arrived at about 9:45. He was a young man, early 20s, wearing a cycling jacket, the kind of courier who does food and package runs on a bike. His name was Tomas. He was new to the app, had only been driving for 3 weeks. Here is the thing about Tomas, the thing that saved my life without either of us knowing it. He'd been given 2 deliveries that morning from the same pickup zone. A package for our office on Burrard, and a separate bakery order for an address on Davy Street. Someone, the app, a dispatch glitch, still unclear, had transposed the addresses in his queue. He delivered the cake to the Davy Street address. At the Davy Street address was Petra. I didn't know any of this at 9:45 in the morning. I was in a meeting. At around noon, one of my colleagues came to tell me that a cake hadn't arrived, that reception had no record of any delivery. I texted Garrett to ask what had happened. He said he'd look into it. He said maybe there'd been a delay. He was, the detective later told me, already beginning to panic. Because at 10:20 that morning, Petra had texted him a photo of the cake box. She'd written, "Did you send me this? You didn't have to. It's not even my birthday, Ang." He hadn't responded immediately. He'd stared at that message for 11 minutes. The timestamp is in the records. She didn't answer. He called again. On the third call, someone answered, but it wasn't Petra. It was a paramedic who had picked up the phone because Garrett's name was showing repeatedly on the screen and they needed to reach someone who knew her. Petra had eaten most of the cake alone at her kitchen table. She'd been found by her roommate. 40 minutes later, she was taken to St. Paul's Hospital by ambulance. She survived. I want to say that clearly, because I know that's what you're wondering. She survived. After 2 days in the ICU and a course of treatment I don't fully understand even now. She survived, and I'm grateful for that in a way I can't entirely explain. She was a person who had no idea what she was eating, whatever her other choices had been. But Garrett didn't know she would survive, not at first. And what he did in those next hours is what undid him completely. He called me from what he thought was a calm voice. He said he'd tracked the delivery, and there'd been an error. The cake had gone to the wrong address. He was so sorry about my birthday. He sounded normal. He sounded like a man handling a minor inconvenience. Meanwhile, his texts to Petra's phone from that morning were sitting on a server somewhere, being read by people in latex gloves. The message he'd sent her at 9:52, before he knew anything had gone wrong. "Don't eat anything today. I'm taking you to dinner. Big news." And then, 40 minutes later, when he still hadn't heard back. "Did you get a delivery this morning? Ignore it if you did. I'll explain later." That second message. "Ignore it if you did." A defense attorney might have tried to explain that. Garrett's attorney certainly tried, later. But there is no good explanation for a husband who sends his wife a birthday cake, and then texts his girlfriend 40 minutes later to tell her to ignore a delivery. There's also no good explanation for the glass vial the police found in the kitchen compost. Garrett had wrapped it in a paper towel, but he hadn't thought about what else had touched it. About the smear on the inside of the cabinet door. About the fact that the compost bin is one of the first places they look. I didn't find out about any of this on October 23rd. I found out in pieces, starting that evening when a detective named Chen called me at home and asked if I could come in the next morning to answer some questions about my husband. That night I sat in the living room of the house my mother left me, and I looked at the man I'd been married to for 11 years, and he looked back at me and said he was sorry I hadn't gotten my birthday cake. I said it was fine. I didn't sleep. The meeting with Detective Chen the next morning lasted 3 hours. I went in thinking it might be about a fraud matter, a business dispute. My mind went everywhere except where the truth actually was. She was careful with me. She asked about our marriage, about Garrett's finances, about whether I'd noticed any recent changes in behavior. She asked me, very gently, whether I had any known allergies or sensitivities, whether I kept any medications at home. When she finally told me what they believed had happened, I heard the words in a strange order. I heard compound found in the cream and incorrect delivery, and hospitalized, and your husband's number and warrant for his arrest. And I sat there in a government badge meeting room in downtown Vancouver and felt absolutely nothing for about 30 seconds. Then I felt everything. Garrett was arrested that afternoon. He was charged with attempted murder, administering a noxious substance with intent to endanger life, and a secondary charge related to the financial irregularities that the investigation turned up almost incidentally. He'd been slowly redirecting money from a joint investment account we held, had been doing it for 8 months. The plan, as far as the Crown was able to reconstruct it, was that I would die. He would inherit under our existing will. And he and Petra would leave Vancouver. She had no knowledge of any of this. She'd thought she was in a relationship with a separated man who was in the process of sorting out his marriage. She came and found me, Petra did, about 4 months after Garrett's arrest. She showed up at the office. My assistant told me there was a woman at reception who said she needed to speak with me. I almost said no. I'm glad I didn't. She was slight, with dark hair cut short, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping. She stood in my office doorway and said she needed me to know that she hadn't known. She said it plainly, without the elaborate apologetic scaffolding people usually build around things like that. Just, I didn't know. I need you to know that. I believed her. We didn't become friends. That's not the kind of story this is. But I did shake her hand before she left, and I meant it, and I think she knew that. The trial took place the following spring. Garrett pleaded not guilty, which I think surprised even his own attorney. He maintained until almost the end that the compound had been introduced during transport, that someone else had tampered with the cake, that he had no explanation for the texts, but that they'd been taken out of context. The jury took less than a day. He was sentenced to 14 years. He'll be eligible for parole in 7. I try not to think about that part. What I think about instead is Tomas, the cyclist with the transposed addresses and the brand new delivery job, who had no idea that getting 2 pickups confused on a Tuesday morning in October had changed the course of several lives at once. I found out later, through the prosecutor's office, that he'd been questioned as part of the investigation and had been shaken by the whole thing. I asked if it would be appropriate to write him a note. They said there was no rule against it. I wrote him a card. I said thank you, without explaining everything, because I didn't know how to explain everything in a card. I said I hoped he was doing well. I don't know if he received it. I hope he did. My mother used to say, and she said it about business, usually, about the way deals fall apart and sometimes fall back together, that you can plan for everything you can see and none of what you can't. She thought this was just the nature of complex systems. I think she was right. I think Garrett planned very carefully and very coldly for everything he could see. And he couldn't see a dispatch error in a courier app. And he couldn't see a 22-year-old with 2 pickups and a mixed-up queue. He also, I think, couldn't see clearly. He'd looked at me for 11 years and seen the house and the trust and the company, and the woman attached to them had gotten blurry. That's the part that took me the longest to make peace with. Not the betrayal, not even the intent to harm me, but the way he'd made me small in his mind, made me something to be moved around. I sold the house in Point Grey. It was my mother's house and I loved it. But I couldn't live there with the kitchen window and the October light. Not without what I now knew had happened in that kitchen. I bought a smaller place in East Van, a 100-year-old character house with original fir floors and a garden that needed serious work. I spent most of last summer in the garden, learning the difference between the things I had to tear out and the things that looked like weeds. My company is still running. I promoted my regional coordinator, Danny, who is better at the job than I was anyway. I see Louisa on Sundays when the weather allows. I go to the Kitsilano bakery sometimes. Not for the honey cake, not yet, maybe someday, and I sit in the window and I drink my coffee and I think about complex systems and the things you can't plan for. I turned 39 last October. I made my own cake. It was cardamom, layered, with cream. I stood in my small East Van kitchen in the pale afternoon light, and I ate a piece over the sink and I did not feel anything dramatic. I felt like a person having cake. That, I think, is what surviving looks like from the inside.